The neon-lit skyline of Arcturus City pulsed like the veins of a living organism, rivers of light flowing between spires of glass and steel where humans and aliens mingled beneath the same electric sky. Ezra Cole had lived there for 3 quiet years, tucked away in a corner apartment overlooking the hovering tram lines and holographic billboards. He'd grown used to anonymity, to blending into the endless hum of a city that never truly slept. That calm ended the day a fox-eared girl with copper hair and a gaze too bright for comfort arrived at his door, suitcase in hand and tail swaying like a banner. Her name was Lyra Vex, and from the instant she stepped inside, Ezra's ordinary life disintegrated into delightful chaos. She called his apartment their den, as if claiming it by instinct, setting down her battered travel satchel and immediately scattering trinkets across the room. Ezra leaned against the doorframe, mug of synth coffee warming his hand, watching in bemused silence as she unpacked feathers tied with red string, pouches of herbs that smelled faintly of citrus and smoke, and carved bone charms etched with looping alien runes. When he finally found his voice, it came out thin and cautious. "That's decorative?" he asked, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Lyra flicked one ear toward him, not looking up as her tail swished lazily. "Blessings," she said matter-of-factly. "Protection, harmony, warmth. A proper den must welcome good spirits." Ezra muttered something about leases and building codes, but she didn't seem to hear. By the time she finished, the curtain rods gleamed with dangling charms, and the faint scent of her herbs clung to every surface. When she finally turned to face him, those amber gold eyes blinked with curiosity. "Your den is very square," she said, scanning the angles of his minimalist furniture. "It's an apartment," he corrected weakly. "Yes, square apartment den. It will do." The confident tilt of her smile made him forget his protest. She hoisted her blanket roll, dragging it straight to the living room floor. Before Ezra could explain where her bedroom was, Lyra dropped the pile beside the couch and burrowed into it like a nesting animal. "This spot smells like you," she murmured, settling contentedly. Ezra choked on his coffee. "Wait, here? You're sleeping here?" "Of course," she replied without opening her eyes. "Denmates stay close." He rubbed his temples, trying to reason with the impossible logic of a species that built nests in shared living rooms. When he told her humans slept in beds, she answered simply, "Vulpinians rest in comfort piles. This is mine." There wasn't much to argue after that. He surrendered, turning the lights low and telling himself he'd get used to it. That night, he didn't sleep much, half listening to the soft rustle of her tail whenever she shifted in the dark. The next evening, Ezra sat on the couch attempting to watch a holodrama when Lyra climbed up beside him as though it were the most natural act in the universe. She wedged herself against his side, tugged the blanket from his lap, and cocooned them both beneath it. Ezra froze mid-breath. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Sharing warmth," she said simply, nestling closer. Denmates exchanged heat. His ears went hot enough to light the room. "People are going to think." She looked up, blinking. "Think what?" "That we are cold." Her innocence disarmed him completely. He gave up trying to explain human social nuance. The holodrama flickered forgotten while Lyra purred softly beside him, the gentle rhythm vibrating through his arm until his pulse matched it beat for beat. When Ezra came home from work the next day, the apartment smelled like burnt herbs and disaster. Steam hissed from the kitchen, where Lyra crouched before the stove, stirring something bubbling and ominous. "I made stew," she declared proudly. Ezra peered into the pot and nearly dropped his briefcase. "That's a pair of socks." She blinked. They needed cleansing. "Heat cleans." "Not like that," he groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That's my only saucepan." "Then you should own more," she said sweetly. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. By the third day, Ezra thought he had adjusted, until he stepped onto the balcony and found Lyra perched on the railing, tail swaying lazily as she sipped tea from his favorite mug. "You'll fall," he warned. She smiled over the rim. "Humans worry too much. Denmates never let each other fall." The way she said it, quiet and sincere, struck him somewhere deep. He sighed, shutting the door before she could see his expression. A week later, she nearly stopped his heart in a crowded cafe. They stood waiting for drinks when her tail looped casually around his waist. Ezra went rigid, face blazing crimson. "Lyra," he hissed. "What are you doing?" Anchoring, she said calmly. So we don't lose each other in the crowd. The cafe went silent around him. Or maybe that was just his own pulse roaring in his ears. That's not. People will think we're together, he muttered. She tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. Are we not? He nearly dropped his cup. Her expression was so guileless it hurt. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to breathe normally while her tail remained a warm, stubborn tether at his side. That night, Ezra lay awake staring at the ceiling, the image replaying endlessly, the soft brush of her fur against his waist, the innocent tone in her voice. Was she really that oblivious? Or was he reading too much into things? He told himself it didn't matter, but when he found a crimson feather resting on his doormat the next morning, doubt returned full force. Lyra, he called. She patted in, tail swaying. You saw it? Lucky feather. It means today will go well. You left it for me? Of course. Denmates exchange morning tokens. Her ears perked proudly. You didn't throw it away, did you? Ezra held it up. No. Still got it. Her smile softened like sunrise. Good. The tokens multiplied. A sachet of dried herbs on his counter, a smooth river stone on his desk, a tiny woven charm tucked into his jacket pocket. Each time he asked, she only said, "It belongs with you." Ezra wasn't sure if that was endearing or terrifying. He began collecting them on his dresser, unsure whether he was indulging superstition or something far more dangerous. One evening he sank onto the couch, exhausted, only for Lyra to climb into his lap without preamble. Couch too small for two, she said, tail curling across his chest. Denmates share space. Ezra made a strangled sound, too aware of her warmth, of how perfectly she fit against him. You could have sat next to me, he managed weakly. I am next to you, she replied, utterly serene. Her tail flicked lazily, brushing his arm, each movement testing his composure. He tried to focus on the hollow screen, but all he saw were gold eyes gleaming softly in the light. When the credits rolled, she murmured, "You are good at staying still," before drifting into a quiet, contented purr that erased any chance of his heart calming down. At the open-air market, her affection became public spectacle. She slipped her arm through his as they walked, leaning close while browsing fruit. Lyra, he whispered urgently, people are staring. Because I found the sweetest one, she said, holding up a golden orb triumphantly. Before he could reply, she leaned up and licked his cheek in thanks. Ezra froze, nearly dropping his wallet. What? Why would you? Vulpinian thanks, she said cheerfully. Humans use words. We use gestures. He could only stare as nearby shoppers politely pretended not to notice. She bit into the fruit, tail wagging happily, leaving him to die slowly inside. Later, on the balcony, she handed him a second mug of tea. Made yours the way you like, she said. They drank in silence while the city glimmered below. Then she spoke softly, almost shy. You are a good denmate, Ezra Cole. Calm, patient. Most humans would not be. His chest tightened painfully. Glad to hear it, he said lightly, though his heart betrayed him. She leaned against his shoulder, tail brushing his leg. I like being here. Ezra stared at the skyline, fighting the flutter in his chest. Don't read into it, he warned himself. It's just culture. But it wasn't getting easier. Every day, new gestures, feathers tucked near his things, food shared from the same plate, her tail looping around him when she laughed. He tried to pretend it was all innocent, that he was misinterpreting alien customs. Yet when he caught her dancing one evening, humming softly as she braided herbs into a circle, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. She glowed under the lamplight, her movements fluid and wild, tail flicking in time with her tune. Ezra stood rooted, captivated. When she noticed him, she blushed faintly, hiding her smile behind the wreath. For luck, she explained. Den wreaths bring fortune. He muttered something about superstition and fled to the kitchen, pulse racing. Another night, while he was fixing a pipe under the sink, she crouched beside him without a word and brushed her fingers through his hair. He yelped, bumping his head. What are you? Checking your coat, she said innocently. Humans shed. I wanted to see if yours is healthy. My coat, he repeated, dumbfounded. She nodded sagely. A denmate must stay well. He could feel her breath near his ear, smell the faint tang of herbs on her skin. I'm fine, he croaked, retreating before he embarrassed himself further. By then, Ezra was beyond saving. Every smile, Every flick of her ears, every accidental brush of her tail sent his thoughts spiraling. He tried distracting himself with work, with noise, with anything, but Lyra filled the apartment like sunlight, unavoidable and warm. The final straw came one evening when he walked in to find her sitting on the couch in one of his shirts. Just his shirt, its hem brushing her thighs, collar slipping off one delicate shoulder. She looked up, completely unbothered. "Too big," she said, tugging at the sleeve until it swallowed her hand. "But it smells like you." "I like it." Ezra forgot how to breathe. "You can't. Humans don't. Why not?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. His brain short-circuited. "Because you just can't." She studied him for a long beat, then smiled slyly. "Okay," she said softly. And before he realized what she meant, she lifted the hem and pulled the shirt off in one smooth motion, handing it back to him. Ezra nearly dropped it. His mind blanked completely as she brushed past, tail flicking his arm. "What's wrong?" she asked with the same calm tone she'd used discussing the weather. He stood there motionless, clutching his shirt like a lifeline, face the color of molten glass. When she disappeared into her room humming, he exhaled shakily and slumped into a chair, certain he was losing his sanity. He spent the next hour staring at his shirt, then, against all better judgment, searched his datapad for Vulpinian denmate customs. The results hit him like a physical blow. Tail wrapping, sign of claim. Gift giving, courting. Shared warmth, bond ritual. Wearing a partner's clothing, declaration of closeness. Purring, exclusive affection toward chosen mate. Ezra set the pad down slowly, pulse thundering. She hadn't been clueless at all. Every gesture, every feather, every shared blanket. Each one was deliberate, a confession in her own language. Lyra Vex had been courting him from the very start. He lay awake for hours afterward, heart racing, staring at the feather still resting on his nightstand, its crimson barbs catching the moonlight. "She likes me," he whispered, half incredulous, half terrified. The thought should have thrilled him, and it did, but it also left him trembling under the weight of it. Somewhere across the hall, faint purring drifted through the walls, steady and content. Ezra buried his face in the pillow, groaning softly. "I am so doomed," he muttered into the dark, knowing full well it was the happiest kind of doom imaginable. Ezra woke from a night of fractured dreaming with the city's neon whisper still clinging to the curtains, his mind looping the same revelation until it frayed at the edges, and the feather on his nightstand glowed like a quiet verdict in the gray morning light. He moved through the apartment on autopilot, the scent of herbs and warm metal guiding him toward the kitchen where the fox girl who had turned his life inside out hummed a lilting tune and worked a spatula with endearing, catastrophic focus. Lyra's ears perked the moment his foot creaked on the threshold, her tail describing a slow half-moon that made the charms above the window wink. "Morning, denmate," she sang softly, like the words were their own ritual, and his pulse missed a step as every line he'd rehearsed evaporated. He reached for the counter as if it might anchor him in gravity he understood. Then he found his voice, and something steadier than panic came with it. "Lyra," he said, and the way her ears tilted at his tone told him she heard every unsaid thing all at once. The stove hissed while her hands stilled, the spatula hovering over a constellation of herb-flecked eggs that smelled like a garden had learned how to warm itself, and the small muscles along her jaw tightened, as if bracing against a storm. Ezra stepped closer and felt every thread of the city's background hum fall away until there was only the soft sound of her breathing and his heartbeat tapping out code he couldn't translate yet. "I looked up Vulpinian customs," he began, and her pupils widened almost imperceptibly while the tip of her tail flicked, betraying the calm she tried to wear like a cloak. He told her what he'd read, the words landing between them like stones, gentle but heavy. Tail wrapping as claim, tokens as courtship, warmth sharing as a bond right, and purring reserved for a chosen mate. When he finished, silence stretched, not brittle but taut, the kind that could turn either into music or breaking glass with one more note. Lyra exhaled, the sound of fragile thread, and she turned fully, ears dipped just enough to admit fear without surrender. "I did not want you frightened," she said at last, fingers curling in the hem of her borrowed sleep shirt, and he understood how much courage sat inside the space between her eyes and the floor. Human rules are sharp in the wrong places. I feared your rules would cut the feeling to ribbons, she added, and the quiet poetry of it hurt him with its honesty. Ezra thought of the 100 times he'd swallowed his questions and laughed off the tremor in his chest as simple cross-cultural static, all because he was afraid to be wrong in a way that would ruin everything. You weren't wrong, he said softly, and the truth of it rang clear even through the rasp in his throat, drawing her gaze up like sunrise draws flowers. He told her he liked her too, said it without cleverness or caveats, and the way joy broke across her face made him dizzy with relief he didn't know his body had been saving. Her tail thumped the cabinet door with undignified enthusiasm, and she surged forward to wrap him in a hug that felt like a verdict reversed, warm and a little wild, her purr unfurling against his chest until the whole room seemed to vibrate with it. He'd imagined this embrace a dozen different ways, all of them careful and tentative, but Lyra loved the way she lived. Open, unapologetic, unabashed, and the force of it scattered his fears like paper in a gust. Ezra's arms found her on instinct, the fit so right it felt pre-written, and he let his forehead drop to her hair where the smell of smoke and citrus, and something he could only name as her flooded his senses. When she leaned back to look at him, the nervousness still shimmered around the edges of her expression, but joy blazed at the center like a signal beacon, steady and impossible to miss. You mean it, she breathed. Not a question so much as a careful step onto new ground, and he laughed helplessly because she had already mapped his every reaction with terrifying precision. He said he meant it twice, and the second admission came out easier than the first, like a path widening beneath his feet the more he used it. Her answer was a mischievous smile and a swift kiss that stole the rest of the air from his lungs, light as a feather's touch, and yet somehow a declaration loud enough to drown the world. Humans kiss very well, she teased when she pulled back, and his ears burned so hot he swore the steam above the pan wavered in sympathy. He muttered something entirely unheroic and promptly forgot what he'd intended to cook for breakfast, because Lyra's tail had slipped around his waist again, the contact both familiar and new now that he understood its meaning. Claiming, she said in a small, satisfied voice that still managed to be smug, and he groaned into a smile that felt reckless in the best way, while the chimes by the window chimed as a tram passed and made the light dance. She fed him a forkful of herbs and eggs like it was a ceremony, and then stole a bite from his plate with predatory precision, licking the fork with theatrical deliberation that sent a lightning bolt straight through his remaining self-control. He accused her of enjoying the effect she had on him, and she replied with the serene audacity of a fox girl who knew exactly how to turn a human romance into a glorious mess. I enjoy you, she corrected gently, and he decided right then that his rules could take several steps back and wait their turn. The rest of the day unfolded like the city had decided to bless their new truth with small conveniences. The hover tram arriving the moment they reached the platform, the market vendors offering samples at the exact second Lyra's curiosity sharpened into mischief, and the drizzle holding off until they were already under the awnings. She slid her hand into his without preamble as they moved through the crowd, and because he had chosen to stop being afraid of being seen, Ezra didn't let go this time. Even when her tail slipped into view and drew a fond glance from a passing Andoran who clearly recognized the gesture. Lyra bought fruit with coins and laughter, tasted spices on the air and declared them too shy, and imperceptibly adjusted her pace whenever the surge of bodies pressed too close, anchoring them as a unit with the casual competence of someone who had decided we was stronger than I. When a vendor complimented her ears, she preened shamelessly and replied that Ezra's were very expressive too, which made him choke and made the vendor grin in happy conspiracy. They split a steaming pastry at a stand whose sign flickered between 3 languages, chewing while traders haggled around them and neon lanterns swayed overhead, and her hand never once left his. He realized on the walk home that his shoulders had loosened for the first time in months, that the tension he'd worn like armor had been replaced by the simpler ache of smiling too much at someone who was very bad for his composure and very good for his heart. That night, the balcony turned into a sanctuary again, the city's pulse below them, the shared warmth between them, and the copper of Lyra's hair catching the light as if it had learned a private way to glow. She brought 2 mugs, as always, but this time the second wasn't an assumption or a tease. It was a conclusion they had reached together, and that made the steam rising from the cups feel like ceremony. "I worried," she admitted, voice soft, tail sweeping slowly across his knees as though keeping time with the neon flicker, and Ezra promised, without speaking, that he would try to be brave enough not to make her do that again. He asked about Vulpinian lullabies, and she hummed one, low and rough and ancient, a melody that felt like the sound a hearth would make if fire learned to sing, and he closed his eyes and memorized it, because some songs you should know by heart. When he opened them, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't bear to break, so he didn't, and the quiet stretched long and gentle, the kind of silence that builds a room around people instead of a wall. Later, when the city exhaled and the apartment settled, Lyra followed him to his doorway and hesitated, one ear lifting in a question she was shy to ask now that the truth was spoken aloud. Ezra stepped aside and thought his answer was eloquent in its simplicity, which made her smile bloom so sudden and bright he felt it like sunlight, and they crossed the low border from separate rooms to the shared space of his bed with embarrassed laughter and relief that clattered like marbles, but ultimately rolled into place. She declared the blankets suboptimal and promptly built a hybrid nest that satisfied both her Vulpinian instincts and his human need to feel like he still owned sheets, which resulted in an arrangement so cozy it made him rethink every bedding choice he had ever made. When she tucked herself against him, purring unself-consciously with her cheek on his shoulder and her tail looped snug around his waist, Ezra's heartbeat did its best impression of a drumline, then finally settled into something steady enough to hold through the night. He pressed a careful kiss to her forehead because he hadn't earned more yet, and because reverence seemed like the correct language to speak to a creature who had undone him this thoroughly. She made a pleased sound that vibrated through bone, then murmured that he smelled like rain after heat and trust after doubt, which was the kind of description that made a human romance feel less like an accident and more like an answer. He slept, not deeply but well, in that half-dream where happiness keeps waking you just to make sure it's real. Morning made everything hilariously ordinary again, which they both seemed to enjoy as a private joke, because now even the small routines gleamed with significance. A second toothbrush laid neatly beside his, a feather by the coffee scoop, her pilfered claim on his favorite mug unchallenged. Lyra darted around the kitchen like a comet with too many opinions about herbs, and Ezra discovered there were at least 6 ways to scramble eggs wrong according to a fox girl who treated seasoning as destiny. She tried to bribe him into learning a Vulpinian card game with the worst poker face he'd ever seen, then cheerfully wrapped her tail around his ankle under the table to improve his focus, which immediately destroyed it. When he accused her of cheating, she said all ding games rewarded sensory cunning and that humans insisted on pretending bodies didn't speak, which made him sputter and made her grin like a thief who had just stolen guilt and replaced it with heat. She won 3 rounds, and if victory looked suspiciously like getting him to blush so hard he forgot the rules, well, she claimed that was just another rule he hadn't learned yet. He threatened to Google it, and she threatened to outculture him, then flicked his ear with a fingertip so light it counted as both affection and warfare. Later, they detoured through the festival streets on the way to the transit hub, drawn by the glow of lantern loops and the soft percussion of street drums, and Lyra took the lead with a confidence that said she had already charted the path of every light. She dragged him by the sleeve to admire beadwork that sparkled like frost and soap bubbles shaped like moons, then lifted herself on tiptoes to whisper useless secrets in his ears simply because she liked the way his knees bent when her breath touched skin. When he pointed out that people were watching, she glanced around with theatrical gravity and announced that they must be watching because his hair had decided to be very handsome today, which earned 3 conspiratorial nods from strangers and destroyed the last remnants of his composure. She paid for candied seed pods and, in front of an audience of lanterns and laughter, licked his cheek in thanks with enough feral pride to scandalize a church and delight a carnival. Ezra gave up complaining for the sake of his blood pressure. Instead, he laced their fingers together and let her choose the route, a human willing to be led then realizing that was a choice too, not surrender. When they finally made it home, her contented sigh as she collapsed across the couch sounded like an ancient word for enough, and that word rearranged his ribs. He did try to reclaim his dignity at least once. confronting her while she sprawled in his favorite shirt with the outrageous comfort of someone who had never learned the human rule about asking before appropriating wardrobes. "You're doing it on purpose," he said, pointing as if the gesture could eject heat from his system by fiat, and she tilted her head with an innocence that had already been ruled legally inadmissible. "Doing what?" she asked sweetly, stretching just enough to reveal a scandal of bare thigh that shorted out the part of his brain responsible for nouns. "All of it," he managed, waving at the shirt, the tail, the smile, the universe conspiring against him, and her grin went fox-wide as though he had finally passed a test she'd been running since the day she moved in. "I am making my human happy," she said with saintly calm that was absolutely not calm, and he clutched his remaining pride to his chest like a damp blanket, then threw it away because it wasn't doing anything useful. She kissed him before his next protest could form, then curled against his side with the triumphant purr of someone who had won an argument by replacing it with joy. He murmured that she would be the end of him, and she hummed a delighted "worth it" against his throat that made the words feel less like prophecy and more like a plan. Days braided themselves into a rhythm that felt chosen rather than stumbled into, a domestic orbit where feathers appeared on his dresser like constellations and tokens hid in the pockets of jackets he hadn't worn in weeks. Lyra adopted his coffee mug every morning without comment and brewed his tea exactly right every night with a pride so fierce it bordered on art, as if mastering his preferences were a language of its own. She insisted the couch was hers in the afternoon and his in the evening and theirs at all other times, a rule that seemed contradictory until he realized contradiction was simply their chosen geometry. At breakfast, she stole bites with theatrical slowness, then defended the theft with cultural precedent so old it might have been invented 5 minutes earlier, and he let her because sharing felt like a verb that tasted better when conjugated with to. On market days, she brushed his hand deliberately when they separated to inspect different stalls, then looped her tail around his arm when they rejoined, not as a question but as punctuation, marking the sentence where two became one again. At night, she sang that lullaby in a voice that made the dark lean in to listen, and Ezra found sleep less a surrender and more a safe place to fall that still smelled like citrus and smoke and home. One evening, the conversation that had been circling them finally chose a landing, carried in on the quiet that follows laughter when both people remember there is a next chapter and that it deserves to be named. They lay tangled in their hybrid nest, Lyra half draped over him with a claim so comfortable it had stopped feeling like audacity and started feeling like weather, and Ezra asked what came after denmates who had said the important truths and shared the important warmth. Her ears shot upright like exclamation marks in fur, her tail thumped his ribs with uncontained enthusiasm, and she blurted "kits" with radiant certainty that turned his pupils into saucers while his soul briefly left his body to file paperwork. She elaborated at speed, little ones with his patient eyes and her very excellent ears, a den shake laughing with small feet, their balcony transforming into a jungle gym of stars, and he forgot language completely for 3 entire heartbeats. Lyra noticed, giggled wickedly, and kissed the confusion off his mouth with an apology that tasted like promise, murmuring that dreams didn't have to be for this minute. They could be for after breakfast, after festivals, after the next lullaby too. Ezra tried to reply something suave, and produced instead a noise best described as mammalian, which delighted her beyond reason and earned him a hug he did not deserve, but accepted with gratitude anyway. The topic curled up at the foot of the bed like a friendly future, and he fell asleep with it guarding them. By the end of the week, the world had not ended under the strain of their happiness, which felt like cosmological negligence and also mercy, and Ezra realized that the human rules he had been so afraid to break had simply never accounted for a fox girl who refused to translate herself into smaller shapes. He adjusted instead, learning the grammar of her tail and the syntax of her ears, the pauses that meant wait and the curls that meant come closer, until communication felt less like a treaty and more like a dance they could both lead whenever the music demanded. Lyra, for her part, learned that humans liked doors knocked and shirts negotiated and cookware not used for sock soup, and she adopted these preferences with a theatrical solemnity that made him laugh but also warmed him with the knowledge of being considered. They swapped rituals, trading feathers for post-it notes, river stones for playlists, braided herb rings for the silly keychain he'd carried since university, and each exchange stitched another seam in the quilt of us. On the street, she claimed him without apology. In the kitchen, he claimed her without words, and the balcony kept their secrets while neon stitched the night together like a soft, bright seamstress. They were two languages teaching each other how to rhyme, and the rhyme never asked permission from the dictionary. The city noticed only in the small ways cities notice, by moving around them like a river that had joyfully discovered a new stone to sing against. He told her about the childhood apartment that smelled like dust and winter heat, where quiet had been a rule rather than a refuge, and she listened with her whole body, ears cupped to catch even the parts he hadn't said aloud. She told him about caravans that moved at the speed of trust, about din lore handed down through pause and laughter, about a mother who sang the same lullaby under a sky cold enough to make breath turn into stars, and he held the images like warm coins he could rub when he needed luck. When she confessed that she had learned human recipes because she wanted to love him in flavors he recognized, he almost cried in an inconveniently public elevator and then pretended the sudden eye shine was due to dust. When he admitted he had cataloged the meanings of her tokens in a secret document on his datapad so he wouldn't fail to honor them, she yanked him down by the collar and kissed him in the doorway like he had just invented care. They argued, once or twice, because living is friction even when it is good, but each time they remembered to return to each other rather than to pride, and each time the return made the room feel larger by a measurable amount. If happiness could be plotted, Ezra thought, theirs would look like a messy spiral that kept passing the same landmarks, each time warmer. The shape suited them, because nests are circles that understand growth. On a rainy evening that turned the city's lights to watercolor, Lyra decided to stage a small rebellion against gravity by balancing along the balcony rail while holding two mugs with the confidence of a fox who believed physics reported to her personally. Ezra opened the door in time to see the slick sheen on the metal, and his heart tried to leave by the emergency exit, but she glanced back with a grin as bright as thunder and said, "Dinmates don't let each other fall," with a calm certainty that erased the storm inside his ribs. He stepped out, hands steady, and stood behind her like a wall that could learn to be gentle, ready to catch yet understanding that the act of readiness was the catching, and she completed her tightrope with a bow whose theatricality made the neighbors applaud from two balconies over. Inside, she offered him his tea with both hands like a gift, and he accepted it like a vow, their fingers brushing in the ritual that had become theirs, and the room felt briefly like a temple they had built by accident and then chosen on purpose. She told him the rain made the city smell brave, and he told her courage often disguised itself as repetition until the right person noticed it, and she kissed him for saying a sentence that long without breathing. They sat on the floor afterward with their backs to the couch and counted tram lights and decided that was a valid hobby, because doing anything together counted as skill. When sleep finally folded over them like a second blanket, Ezra thought about all the edges he had once used to keep himself safe, and how Lyra had rounded them with attention until they were soft enough to sit on. He drifted in the steady hush of her purr and the heartbeat of a city that had learned to make room for 1,000 kinds of quiet, thinking that maybe rules were scaffolding and maybe love was the thing you build when you climb past them and find you are not afraid of heights anymore. The last thing he felt was the circle of her tail settling at his waist, warm and sure. The old claim now a comfort he didn't know how to live without, and he accepted his doom like a door he was happy to close because it led to a room with her in it. Tomorrow would bring more herbs, more feathers, more shared forks, more embarrassment manufactured with scientific precision and delivered with glee, and he welcomed it all with the greedy gratitude of someone who had rerouted his life and liked the new map better. The rain pressed soft palms against the window, and the charms chimed like blessings learning to speak human, and he smiled in his sleep because the sound translated without effort. Somewhere in the apartment, a token waited to be discovered, tucked into a jacket pocket he hadn't used in months, and the thought felt like the universe leaving him love notes in places he'd almost forgotten. He slept, happy and doomed, and exactly where he chose to be. The following morning rose with the soft hue of pearled clouds drifting over Arctura's skyline, and the apartment hummed with the low pulse of city life filtering through the windows. Ezra stirred first, disoriented by the warmth pressed against his side, and the faint vibration of a purse so steady it could have been part of the building's rhythm. Then memory caught up, sliding into place like the last piece of a puzzle. The softness of Lyra's tail looped over his leg, the scent of herbs in her hair, and the undeniable truth that his life had shifted into something extraordinary overnight. He lay there for a long minute, listening to her slow breathing, realizing how peaceful the world felt when shared with someone who didn't fit into any human rulebook. When she finally opened her eyes, her smile was still hazy with sleep, ears twitching lazily as she murmured, "You look like you dreamed in color." He laughed softly, replying, "You're the reason everything's brighter," and her tail gave a happy flick that brushed his stomach and destroyed any remaining chance of calm. Breakfast became an experiment in cultural translation again. Lyra perched on the counter, tail flicking idly as Ezra tried to explain why humans didn't store jam jars inside the freezer or put bread in the utensil drawer. She tilted her head, unrepentant, and said, "Because I thought cold preserves flavor, and your drawer looked lonely." He sighed through a grin, surrendering faster each day. "You're impossible," he muttered, and she beamed, replying, "Possible enough to keep you smiling." Somewhere between her rearranging every spice jar alphabetically and his attempts to cook something that didn't smoke, they found a rhythm that felt like domestic chaos with intention. The apartment wasn't just his anymore. It hummed with life, laughter, and occasional mischief, as if the walls themselves approved of their strange, interspecies duet. Later that week, Ezra brought Lyra to his favorite cafe, the same one that had nearly broken him the last time her tail wrapped around his waist in public. This time, she seemed almost proud of the attention, her ears perked high, tail swaying behind her like a banner declaring victory. "You realize everyone's staring, right?" he murmured, half hiding behind his cup. Lyra's golden eyes gleamed. "Then they can learn what happiness looks like," she said with disarming sincerity, and Ezra found himself smiling despite the heat creeping into his cheeks. She reached across the table, brushing his fingers lightly, and it was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. The first time she had touched him, it had been instinct. Now, it was intention. Every gesture since their confession carried weight, an unspoken promise that neither of them wanted to take back. Her curiosity about humanity deepened as her comfort with him grew. She wanted to understand everything. Why humans greeted strangers with handshakes instead of scent, why they built homes with corners, why their laughter always carried a little sadness at the edges. Ezra tried to explain, fumbling through concepts that made perfect sense in practice, but none in theory. "Humans are complicated," he said finally, after she spent 15 minutes trying to comprehend the idea of small talk. Lyra's response was simple. "No, you just pretend to be. You hide your hearts too well." It wasn't criticism, it was observation. And the truth of it lingered in the air long after the conversation ended. One evening, while he worked on his datapad, Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, practicing writing human script. Her handwriting was crooked but determined, every letter a small victory. When she showed him the word she'd finally managed to form, home, he felt something in his chest melt. "That's perfect," he told her, and she smiled with such warmth it made the lights flicker. "I know," she said quietly, "because that's what this place is." The room fell still. Outside, the neon signs pulsed in slow rhythm, like the city itself was listening. Ezra wanted to answer, to tell her how much that word meant coming from her. But before he could, she leaned over and rested her head on his knee, purring softly. Words, it seemed, weren't always necessary between them. Their neighbors began to notice. The older Andarin woman from next door dropped off sweetbreads one morning, smirking as she said, "Nice to see your den growing lively, human boy." Ezra stammered, and Lyra accepted the basket graciously, thanking her in fluent Andarin dialect, tail wagging with pride. "You're making friends," he said after the door closed. "I'm making allies," she corrected, then winked. Every den needs a network. She'd even started teaching some of the local shopkeepers phrases in Vulpinian, which led to Ezra overhearing a grocer cheerfully call him the one with the fox wife when he came in alone. Lyra found it hysterical. Ezra found it slightly terrifying. "You're building a reputation," he said. "A good one," she replied, wrapping her tail around his wrist. "They know you're loved. Not every day was perfect. Their differences occasionally collided in ways neither expected. There was the time Lyra decided to cleanse the apartment of bad energy using smoke from burning herbs that set off the fire alarms, sending Ezra sprinting with a towel to fan the detector. Another morning, she accidentally flooded the bathroom because she believed running water helped the spirits travel faster. He scolded her. She sulked for exactly 10 minutes before reappearing with an apology gift, another feather, this one braided with a thread of gold. "For patience," she said, slipping it into his hand. "You needed to live with me." He laughed and admitted she wasn't wrong. Despite the chaos, Ezra couldn't deny that she changed the texture of his days. Mornings were warmer, nights quieter in a comforting way. When she wasn't around, the apartment felt too still, as though even the hum of the city dimmed. Lyra filled every silence with life, sometimes literally, when she decided to sing old Vulpinian songs that made the air vibrate. He learned the rhythms, even the pauses between her words, until he could almost hum along. And though she never said it outright, he understood that sharing those songs meant more than any verbal declaration. One rainy evening, Lyra tugged him toward the balcony again. The city stretched below like a field of reflected stars, lights rippling across the wet glass towers. She perched on the railing with the balance of someone who trusted gravity to behave differently for her, and Ezra stood close enough to catch her if it didn't. "Do you ever miss your world?" he asked softly. Her tail slowed, curling loosely around her ankles. "Sometimes," she said after a pause, "but not enough to leave. My world didn't have you." He reached out before he could stop himself, resting a hand gently on her back. "You're ridiculous," he whispered, smiling despite the ache in his chest. "Yes," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "But I'm your ridiculous." The rain began to fall again, misting around them, and for once, Ezra didn't move to drag her inside. He just stood there, letting the storm wash over them both. When they returned to the couch, Lyra curled up beside him in her usual spot, half on him, half wrapped in her blanket nest. "You think too much," she murmured, eyes half closed. "You love too loud," he countered. "That's how it fits," she replied. He wanted to ask what she meant, but her purr drowned out his question. Sometimes, meaning didn't need words. Days turned into weeks. Ezra noticed small changes in her habits. The way she left him space in the closet, the way she checked the temperature of his tea before handing it to him, the way she started using the word "we" without hesitation. Once, while preparing for work, he found one of her charms tucked into his coat pocket. It was shaped like a small spiral, smooth and polished. When he asked about it, she said simply, "It's for return. So you always find your way home." He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Their affection deepened quietly, without fireworks or grand gestures. Instead, it grew through shared breakfasts, long walks under neon skylines, whispered jokes, and the unspoken comfort of presence. Lyra's purring became the soundtrack to his evenings, her laughter the rhythm to his mornings. And every time her tail brushed against him, it no longer startled, it reassured. Yet even in happiness, uncertainty lingered. Ezra sometimes wondered what their future could look like in a world that still divided species by rules and expectations. He voiced the thought one night while they watched trams glide through the mist. "Do you think people will ever understand us?" he asked quietly. Lyra didn't hesitate. "They don't have to," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We do." Her certainty was a warmth all its own. He nodded, content to borrow her faith until he found his own again. That night, as he drifted toward sleep, the city hummed outside, a lullaby of engines and rain. Lyra was already curled in her nest beside his bed, tail rising and falling with her breathing. He turned over to look at her, smiling at the sight. There, in the half-light, surrounded by trinkets and feathers and the smell of her herbs, Ezra realized something profound. She had come into his life like a storm, and somehow, in her chaos, he had found peace. He whispered her name once, softly, just to hear it blend with the rain. Lyra stirred, opening one eye, then smiled that sleepy, contented smile that made everything right. "Go to sleep, human," she murmured. "Tomorrow needs us rested." He laughed quietly, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of running or searching. He dreamed of home. Morning sunlight poured through the window, spilling across the couch where Lyra had somehow migrated during the night, half buried beneath a tangle of blankets and her own tail. Ezra stirred at the sight, fighting back a laugh. Living with her had turned even mornings into unpredictable stories. She mumbled in her sleep, the faint vibration of a purr humming beneath her breath, and one ear twitched lazily as the light touched her face. He stood there, mug in hand, watching her with the kind of tenderness that frightened him, not because it was fragile, but because it was permanent. When her eyes blinked open, gold catching the morning glow, she smiled drowsily. "You were staring," she said, voice thick with sleep. "You make it hard not to," he admitted, and her tail thumped once against the cushions in satisfaction before curling tighter around her legs. Life settled into a rhythm that felt impossible to explain to anyone else. Ezra went to work, navigating the sterile corridors of his office where no one knew that a fox girl made his apartment smell like cedar and laughter. Every evening, he returned to find her waiting, sometimes perched on the balcony with a cup of tea, sometimes halfway through reorganizing his kitchen based on what felt happiest. The apartment had become a strange mixture of their worlds, his clean lines softened by her organic chaos, her wild trinkets balanced by his need for order. They hadn't planned it, but the space had evolved into something uniquely theirs, something that no longer obeyed the design of either species. Their love wasn't dramatic, it was built in moments. In the quiet hum of cooking dinner together while rain pattered against the windows. In the way she would steal the first sip of his coffee every morning, declaring it her safety check. In how she learned to fold laundry properly, just so she could leave little feathers in between his shirts like secret messages. Sometimes, she'd fall asleep with her head in his lap while he read, her breathing syncing perfectly with his. Other times, she'd drag him onto the balcony to chase moonlight reflections off the glass towers and tell him stories of her home world, how Vulpinians believed stars were memories of ancestors watching over their dens. "Then they must love seeing you," he'd say quietly, and she'd smile, whispering, "Only because you stand beside me." Not everything was simple. One evening, Ezra came home late to find Lyra sitting in the dark, her tail wrapped tightly around her knees. The usual sparkle in her eyes was dimmed, replaced by something uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked carefully. She shook her head. "I was just thinking," she murmured. "About staying." He froze, unsure what she meant. "You could go anywhere," she continued softly. "I came here to see your world, but I never thought I'd stay in it." He moved closer, crouching beside her. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, the words tasting bitter. She looked up, tears threatening the edges of her golden eyes. "No," she said quickly. "That's what scares me." Ezra reached out, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "Then don't be scared," he said gently. "We'll make this place yours too." She leaned into his touch, her purr returning like a sigh of relief. "You humans," she whispered. "You promise things like you're casting spells." "Maybe I am," he replied, smiling. "And maybe it's working." After that night, she seemed lighter again, more sure. She began teaching him bits of her culture more deliberately. How to interpret tail gestures, how to respond to a Vulpinian greeting, even how to brew tea the right way, which apparently involved talking to the water first. "Water listens," she insisted. "It carries mood." Ezra pretended to argue, but secretly started doing it when she wasn't around. Weeks blurred into months. The seasons shifted, and the city's colors changed from blue neon to soft amber, reflecting off the clouds like painted glass. Their balcony became a garden of mismatched plants, some human, some alien, that somehow thrived together. Lyra claimed it was because they liked being a family, and Ezra didn't dare disagree. Every evening, they sat there as the sun sank behind the towers, her tail draped lazily across his lap, her voice weaving stories about constellations he'd never heard of. In those moments, the world beyond their apartment felt distant, irrelevant. There was only her, the light, and the quiet rhythm of a bond that had outgrown words. Then, one night, the power went out. The entire block plunged into darkness, the hum of machinery replaced by the sound of rain and the soft rush of wind through open windows. Ezra lit a candle, and the flickering glow painted Lyra's features in warm gold. She looked at the flame with fascination, her eyes wide and reflective. "It dances like your kind," she said softly. "Always burning, always moving." He smiled, handing her the candle. "And you?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. I'm the wind, she replied. I make it brief. She placed the candle on the table, then turned to him, her expression suddenly serious. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked. After this. You mean us? He said. She nodded. We built something strange, Ezra. Beautiful, but strange. What happens when the world notices? He looked at her for a long time before answering. Then we teach it how to understand. Her smile returned, slow, proud, a little teary. You really think we can? We already are, he said simply. One rule at a time. She laughed, a sound soft and wild, and pulled him close, her purr filling the dim room. Then I'll follow you anywhere, she whispered against his neck. But only if you bring snacks. He laughed too, and for a while, they just sat there in the candlelight, the city outside flickering back to life one building at a time. Months later, Ezra woke to find a small bundle on his pillow, a collection of feathers, herbs, and a tiny charm shaped like a heart. He turned to see Lyra pretending to be asleep, her tail twitching in barely contained excitement. What's this? He asked, though he already knew. She peeked one eye open. A promise token, she said, voice soft. Means I choose to stay. Means you're my forever den. Ezra's throat tightened. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. Then I guess this is your forever home, he whispered. She purred so deeply it made the windows vibrate, and for a moment, it felt like the city itself approved. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and violet, they stood on the balcony again, their garden rustling softly in the breeze. Lyra leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, her tail looping lazily around his waist. You know, she murmured, if anyone told me I'd fall for a human who alphabetizes his spices, I'd have called them insane. And yet here you are, he said, smiling. Here I am, she echoed. They watched as the first stars appeared above the skyline, faint but steady, and for once, Ezra didn't wonder what tomorrow would bring. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Tonight was enough. This balcony, this fox girl, this strange and perfect home. When they finally went inside, Lyra paused by the doorway, looking back at the city. Your world is loud, she said softly, but it listens if you love it loud enough. Ezra nodded. You taught me that. She smiled, closing the door behind them, and in that simple motion, the noise of the city faded into a heartbeat that belonged only to them. The lights flickered once, then settled, casting a warm glow across the apartment. Their den, their home, their shared story. And somewhere, among the feathers and herbs and laughter, a new rule was written quietly into the universe. Sometimes, the strangest bonds make the strongest homes.